Hello and welcome to another digital presentation from the National World War II Museum. I'm glad that you could join me today. I'll be speaking about D-Day innovations, thinking outside the box at Normandy. We're going to start with our Axis innovations. The Axis had a large problem, was the Atlantic Wall. They had to defend the coast of Europe from the border with Spain to Finland. And as you can see in this slide, all the yellow space there, that's quite a long way. And so they had to have some new original thinking on how they were going to be able to accomplish that. One of the first things they did was to redistribute captured material. You can see here, of course, you're not going to be able to move that concrete pillbox, but steel emplacements like these Czech Hedge hogs are easily transported, relatively. Many locations in Europe had borders with Germany that didn't have a natural defensive barrier, like a river or mountains, and so they built obstacles like these Czech hedgehogs from the Czech Republic to provide anti-tank barriers at their borders. These were moved and redistributed along the coast in France and Norway. Another version of this same idea were the Belgian gates, of course, from Belgium. These could be assembled in lines originally and staked in place. You can see the stakes where they're joined together. They were built with rollers so they could be moved if needed. These were very good defensive pieces, and they were often put further out into the tide and also acted as obstacles for landing craft. Another idea that the Germans had that worked well for them, and excuse my poor German pronunciation, Regelbou, or standard build. The Germans developed over 600 standard plans for defensive emplacements. And of course, 600 is quite a bit for having standard plans, but when considering what they were up to, it's not a bad idea. One of the most common emplacements that they built was the ringstand, or as Allies like to call them, Tobruk's. These became Tobruk's because they were first encountered at Tobruk. This was a defensive foxhole that allowed space for a machine gun or a light mortar and provided a standard emplacement that was easily built and constructed. Another thing they had were standard components for these concrete bunkers, like the doors and machine gun apertures. These allowed them to be produced in factories and shipped to the site and easily installed. All the forms for the concrete, they knew what they needed to have to make it fit, so that helped a lot with production. The Germans used slave labor for their construction work, and over 1 million tons of steel and 17 million tons of cubic meters of concrete were used in building the Atlantic Wall. Now, I'm not exactly sure where they managed to get all that, but most likely they simply stopped production of everything else and used all the steel capacity and concrete capacity of their captured countries to provide that. They also used the integration of captured weapons. For example, in France, German divisions would be equipped with French weapons. This allowed them to use the locally stored ammunition and provide these weapons to their troops, particularly second-line divisions. Sometimes they were fortunate enough to have 8mm weapons, 8mm rifle cartridge, a 9mm pistol cartridge, and these they integrated directly into their supply system. They also used things like this French R35 turret that was removed from the little tankette. The tankette was converted to an ammunition carrier or to an artillery tractor, and then the turret was installed on a standard build piece, providing additional armament. They also used anything that came up in the armament industry. For example, this was a prototype turret for a German tank. It may have been the only one they had, or maybe they had 3 or 4. Didn't matter. They shipped these over to their coastal defense area. One of the pieces that was well liked by the Germans was the 8mm Browning water-cooled machine gun. This was originally built as a licensed copy of Browning's 1917 machine gun, built under license for the Polish Army, but built an 8mm rifle cartridge, same as the German Army. And so this particular piece was very easy for them to adapt and supply ammunition to. This is the type of weapon that Franz Gockel manned at Omaha Beach. They also took captured artillery. This is a French 155mm gun. This is the type of gun that was emplaced at Pointe du Hoc and then later moved back because of the Allied bombings. The French had many of these guns. They were effective. They were an older design, but they could be used in place, great for defense on the Atlantic Wall. This was a turret from a French battleship, originally built before World War I. Again, take it off, re-emplace it, use it on land, adapt, reuse. One of their other ideas were fixed divisions. When you have an infantry division, even one that's not mechanized, requires a lot of transport to be able to move them. Trucks and jeeps or vehicles, all that type of thing. Well, the Germans said, you know, that's a lot of material we don't have, so we are going to have divisions that don't move. These will be fixed divisions. We're going to put them in their spot on the Atlantic Wall, and they're not going to have transport. They are not going to be able to move because we really don't want them to anyway. They're going to basically be expected to defend in place until they're annihilated or they're victorious or they're reinforced. So by doing that, the Germans were able to create even more divisions with less materiel. They also used what they called Ost Battalions or East Battalions. These were battalions made up of citizens of the Soviet Union who had been captured and perhaps did not have a strong inclination to be Soviet citizens, or had a stronger inclination to not starve to death in prison camps, and so were recruited into the German army. They may not have been very enthusiastic about fighting for the Germans, but they were more enthusiastic about that than being shot by their NCOs, and so these also helped stretch manpower. Now the Allies, they came up with many, many innovations. One of the primary ones, or one of the major ones, was deception. And you may have seen our presentation last week on the Ghost Army, which was part of the deception plan. Instead of coming up with divisions manned by people who may or may not have been very loyal, the Allies came up with divisions that didn't exist at all. Here we have an inflatable tank. You can make a lot of inflatable tanks for the cost of a regular tank. They also put on paper, either known as phantom or ghost divisions. These are some of the shoulder patches from the airborne divisions that didn't exist except on paper. By producing the patch, they had a tangible item that spies could see. They could show these things existed, and they moved them around on paper. They even went to the extent that they would show regular divisions being split up and their assets assigned to form these other divisions. Of course, this only happened on paper, but all of this was part of Patton's fake army and the forces that were assigned to make the invasion at the Pas de Calais. Another piece that they came up with, dropped on June 6th, was known as Rupert. This was a simple cloth dummy. This is an original at the museum. A small, about 3 feet tall, has a small parachute. These would be thrown out from airplanes, and troops would see that there was an airborne assault going on, and then they would be wandering around reporting. This lended greatly to confusion, especially even once they'd been found, that somebody said, oh, you know, we thought there was an airborne assault, but it's actually a puppet. Well, oh, well, then is the real airborne assault a puppet or not? And so great confusion on the night June 5th, June 6th. Paratroopers. We actually did use paratroopers quite a bit. Up to that time, it was the largest drop, not the largest drop of the war, but a very large drop. Paratroopers placed behind the front lines to secure key elements. This was a new idea in World War II, the idea of vertical envelopment, placing these troops. And one of these individuals was my father, Alphonse Czekanski. He had originally enlisted in the Army before the war, had been assigned at Schofield Barracks when Pearl Harbor was bombed, volunteered for Officers Candidate School, and was assigned to the 376th Field Artillery Battalion. He had served in North Africa, Sicily, Italy, Anzio, and then came back to England. Now, he was with the 504th Regimental Combat Team, and as you may know, that outfit didn't go into Normandy as a whole, but many individuals volunteered to fill out the spaces in planes, provide extra individuals. So he landed near Saint-Mère-Église on the night or on the morning of June 6th, and eventually ended up at Lafayette Causeway. Gliders. Gliders, another great innovation of World War II, used very effectively by the Germans at the beginning of the war. We saw this. One of the best things about gliders is that it deploys the entire contents of the glider in one place. Nobody gets scattered. Your whole glider might get scattered, but your glider ends up in the right place with everybody in it. And the perfect example of this, the spot where gliders worked exactly as they should, were the British gliders that landed at what's now known as Pegasus Bridge, or the bridge over the Orne River Canal. Now, this bridge is on the Allied left flank and secures the left flank because the canal has to be crossed by the bridge. And if you look here in the slide, you will see that's a glider, that's a glider, that's a glider, here's the bridge. You really just can't get any better than that for landing on target with 3 loads of gliders all together. Now, it's not generally discussed, but in fact, there was a 4th glider. It completely missed the target and landed next to a bridge some miles further away. At first, they thought everyone else was lost. By the time the sun came up and they'd found a French person to explain to them where they were, they beat a hasty retreat back to the correct bridge. But this is a perfect example of the use of gliders to envelop a target. Another very important individual was Percy Hobart, a general in the British Army, and he produced what are known as Hobart's Funnies. He was charged with developing specialized vehicles specifically for the assault at Normandy. The most well-known of these, of course, is the Duplex drive tank. This utilized a Sherman tank that was designed to float. Now, at 30 tons, a Sherman tank doesn't float. What they had to do was create more surface area, and so they used the collapsible canvas skirt, which you can see here raised. This is a rear view, and they also fitted these propellers. Thus, the Duplex drive version, they could drive with the tracks or with the propellers. Now, the canvas screen is inflated with air cylinders inside, canvas air cylinders, and so it doesn't have a lot of rigidity. And many of these tanks were lost because they didn't go with the current. They tried to steer towards their objectives as the tide was pushing them down the beach, and eventually they would get swamped. One of the great omissions in the Duplex drive tank was that it didn't have a bilge pump. So once water started to come over the top, you were in trouble. Also, this canvas side is so tall that the tank commander had to stand on top of the turret to see over it to tell where he was going. So really not the best idea, although several of them did reach the beach. Hobart also invented this crab tank or flail tank. This utilized the power of the tracks to drive that forward chain flail. It was a big drum with heavy chains on it. This would go through the ground and set off landmines. The armored ramp carrier, another great idea. This is a tank chassis with a folding bridge on top of it. You can see here the cables that are attached to the bridge. They're run by a winch inside. And here's a version of it underneath the Sherman. You can see how it can easily skirt a berm, or it could also be used over a ditch. So a portable bridge. The AVRE, Assault Vehicle Royal Engineers. When engineers were planning these operations, they said, look, we need some way to get our engineers up to obstacles, undercover, with some armor protection to be able to place charges to blow things up. So they modified a tank. One of the things they did right in the center was add a door here into the crew compartment. This allowed them to drive the tank up to an obstacle, use the tank to provide some cover, and in place munitions to blow things up. They also had a large mortar here. The round was so big you actually had to get out of the tank to load it from the outside. It didn't really matter because it was so big you usually only needed one round to take out most obstacles. This was a very effective piece used by the British, not adopted by the US. Landing craft. Now, the biggest single innovation of the whole war that made the landing at Normandy possible were landing craft. As General Eisenhower, then former President Eisenhower, said to Stephen Ambrose, without Higgins and the Higgins boat, the entire course of the war would have been different. Before World War II, forces did not land on opposed beaches. Normally they would land on an unopposed beach and then immediately move to capture a harbor so they could bring in ships. Dieppe showed that that was not really practical at all in World War II, and so the development of landing craft was essential to our success. One of the smallest versions was the British-made craft, the LCA, Landing Craft Assault. This was like a Higgins boat, arranged differently, similar characteristics, but armored. It did have that small doors at the front, the ramp, and small doors where troops would exit. One advantage troops liked about this particular vessel was that the passengers sat down in it. And for bobbing in an open sea, that was nice. Of course, the Higgins boat, landing craft, vehicle, and personnel. You can fit a Jeep in here. You can fit an artillery piece. You can put 30-some men in there, and you can get them to the beach. Made of plywood in New Orleans, easy to build, inexpensive, build lots of them, and get there on the beach. A bigger version of that, the LCM, Landing Craft Mechanized. Difficult to see in this picture, but that's a Sherman tank sitting in the well deck of this vessel. Really built like an oversized LCVP, but big enough to hold a Sherman tank. Great for getting people to the shore. Probably should have used these instead of Duplex Drive. Would have got tanks on the beach and been set. LCIs. Once you have a foothold on the beach and you're not so worried about direct fire, you can bring in landing craft infantry. These are designed to hold a company of infantrymen, about 200 men. Had accommodations on board. They could all have a bunk. They could sleep on the trip over. These vessels actually did cross the channel on their own from England to Normandy. You can see they had 2 ramps for unloading troops. Later versions had a bow door similar to the landing ship tank. Very effective. Landing craft tank. Again, another larger vessel this would hold 6 tanks. These cross the channel. This is what DD tanks were launched from. And there was one ensign who was in charge of one of these vessels at Omaha Beach. His first tank drove off and immediately sank. In the confusion, the second tank backed into the third tank, and both of them tore their canvas skirts. He said that's the end of that nonsense, and drove his LCT onto the beach, where his tanks were able to drive directly on and provide support. They also had a version of the LCT that had a ramp not only at the front, but doors at the back. And so several of them could be lined up front to back so that they could unload vessels, or they could act as a ramp to get the things from landing ship tank that might not be able to get close enough to the beach on shore. The duck, that's actually the manufacturer's code. This is built on the CCKW. This is a GMC vehicle, a floating truck. Again, this is similar to the duplex drive in that the wheels turn and there's a propeller in the back. The big thing that's great about this is you can drive out to a freighter. You can swim out there if the tide is in, or you can come in, drive on the sand if you need to. It had a system for adjusting tire pressures to help you keep from getting stuck. They would load 3 cargo nets worth of supplies. They figured out quickly that handling supplies is not it's a time-consuming and labor-consuming thing. They would take cargo nets, lift them with the winches from the freighters, put 3 nets worth into the back of the truck. The truck would drive inland. They calculated that up to 5 miles was an optimum distance. They would drive to a supply point and then use a crane to unload the 3 nets. They would throw 3 empty nets back in the truck, and they were on their way again for a round trip to bring in more supplies. These were essential in the early days of the Normandy landing to keep our troops supplied and build up supplies. It's particularly important before the Mulberry harbors went into use. Landing ship tank. This was purpose-built. These originally, the design and concept came from an oil tanker that was designed to pick up oil in Venezuela. The oil fields there were in a shallow bay, and they had a very shallow draft tanker to come in and take out product. They looked at these and thought, you know, we can use these to haul tanks. There's actually a building at Fort Knox where they built the entire interior of a landing ship tank and practiced training people to load tanks into the space. And they also used the building so that they could very effectively measure and plot out where every item in the vessel should be placed for optimum use as a tank carrier. These will hold 30 tanks, 3 rows. You have a bow ramp, everybody backs in, and then you can all drive out. It's a great way to deliver tanks. One of the other innovations that they had, the infantry was reorganized into assault teams so that every landing craft vehicle and personnel that came ashore had the necessary means to assault the position. They made sure that they had mortars, machine guns, bazookas, and flamethrowers all together in every boat. Another innovation that they tried and was produced in limited numbers for the first wave particularly was the assault vest. They had the idea that people might want to carry more ammunition, more supplies, more grenades. So they made a canvas belt or canvas vest to wear over your equipment. Unfortunately, these came out kind of late, so most people hadn't trained with them. Nobody was quite sure whether you should wear this over your equipment or exactly what to do with it. It was a nice idea, didn't really go very far. They also found, we were worried, gas masks only work if the filter is dry. And the German army, the gas mask is in a sealed metal can. Well, we didn't have time to make a bunch of metal cans, so we rubberized the bag. And this was the assault gas mask. Could be carried, you rolled the top down, that kept things dry. The bazooka was produced during World War II, came out in 42, provided means for the infantryman to fire a 3-inch rocket at his target. These were widely used at Omaha and Utah Beach. 4.2-inch chemical mortar. This was designed after World War I and originally intended to develop chemical munitions like mustard gas. Well, once we saw that chemical weapons weren't being extensively used, we had formed all these battalions of chemical mortars, and so we developed an explosive round. The explosive round had basically the same destructive capacity as a 105mm howitzer. The great thing about the 4.2-inch mortar was you could get a whole battalion of 4.2-inch mortars on the beach in much less shippage, much less transport than the 105mm howitzer. You could even bring the 4.2-inch mortar ashore in an LCVP. You could do that with a 105, but then you needed a truck to get the thing out and haul it into position, such. So 4.2-inch mortars were added to the assault units. They also had a shorter range that was able to land shells closer to the front line, which was very effective while they were stuck on the beach. Here, an example of the 4.2-inch mortar in action. Anti-aircraft balloons. One of the units that has been discussed considerably, there was an African-American barrage balloon battalion that was assigned to Omaha and Utah Beach. Their task was to bring in barrage balloons during the assault. Early in the morning, they were bringing these small balloons in. The balloons were run up on a cable, and the balloons with their cables would force enemy aircraft to fly at a higher elevation and help to protect the beach from strafing and bombing runs. This is one of the few units that was assigned to both beaches, and they did an excellent job of bringing in the balloons. My uncle, Julian Czekanski, he served with the 2nd Armored Division. On June 6th, he was on an LST off the coast of Normandy. He was supposed to land that day, but because the beachhead was so congested, he didn't land until D+6, and eventually gets through the whole war and ends up in Berlin. Tanks, of course, a major innovation in World War II, and our ability to land tanks rapidly from landing ship tanks and get them ashore made a crucial difference in all of our landings. Of course, one of the biggest innovations and most ambitious projects were the portable harbors, also known as Mulberry harbors. 2 of these were produced, one to be installed for the British and one for the Americans. Somebody sits down and says to themselves, we really need a harbor to unload ships and men and materiel, but we're not going to be able to capture one. So what are we going to do? And somebody says simply, we're going to bring one with us. We'll build one, we'll move it, we'll install it. And that is in fact what they did. You can see here how effective the breakwaters are. These are older ships or ships that were damaged. Also caissons, concrete built pieces, and they were sunk to provide a breakwater. You can see how rough the water is out here and how calm inside. This made unloading ships very easy. We also installed floating roadways so that trucks could be unloaded directly from vessels onto the floating runways and brought ashore. Whether the tide was in or out didn't matter. It was a great advantage. Another image, you see what are known as Phoenixes here along this side. These were concrete barges built that could be flooded, had anti-aircraft emplacements on top. The whole thing encloses a Mulberry harbor. They also had the idea that railway cars could be delivered by LST. They laid temporary track inside the LST, 3 rows of it, had a special bridge that got from the ship to the beach, could use a cable to haul these things out, and were able to deliver additional railway cars for use in supply directly to the beach. They also knew that they were going to have issues with petroleum oil and lubricants, particularly gasoline, and they developed what was called PLUTO, pipeline under the ocean, a special flexible pipeline about 4 inches in diameter was constructed, and the pipe was wound onto these bobbins and then deployed across the English Channel. In practice, they had unending trouble with it. The first pipeline they finally got installed was almost immediately snagged by the anchor of a vessel. They had trouble with breaking down and all kinds of things, but it was a great idea, and they gave it a good shot. And eventually, by the end of the war, they had 7 pipelines running across the English Channel. Now, probably our best remembered, and often his name is forgotten, Curtis G. Culin came up with one of the best innovations of all, and that was the Hedge Cutter. Once we'd finally gotten off the beach, we moved into the bocage country, the area where there were hedgerows. And when a tank tries to drive over a hedgerow, great mound of earth with trees and such above, it just drives over the top. No particular trouble for getting over it, but the bottom of the tank, its weakest point, is exposed. Culin used surplus steel from material obstacles found on the beach, cut them up, welded together, produced these. It acts like a plow. When the tank hits the hedgerow, instead of driving over, it pushes through. Made every tank a bulldozer, made it possible for us to come at the enemy from many different directions. You see the result of the use of a hedge cutter, and this helped us with the breakout finally from the Normandy beachhead. So thank you very much. If there are any questions, I'll be happy to answer them at this time. I see I have a question. Was our success at Normandy assured? Many people think today that Normandy was assured. No, we were going to take that land without any trouble at all. And of course, we did have very high casualties at Omaha Beach, but our landing was not assured. One great example would be Anzio, where our forces got ashore and were then blockaded. The entire same thing could have happened at Normandy. How many duplex drives are still in the channel? I'm really not sure, although I know there are some there. Some years ago, we were approached by an individual who wanted to recover a duplex drive tank. And one of the things that we learned in our investigation is that the tanks that are still there now are beyond recovery. They've been rusted away to just completely being unstable. How many of these vehicles does the museum have? So I think of the vehicles we've discussed today, the museum has a landing craft vehicle and personnel. We have a C-47 that was actually used at Normandy that's suspended in our museum. We have a Sherman tank, we have a Stuart tank, half tracks. So a great many of the vehicles that were used at Normandy, of the type used, are represented at the museum. How important was the weather at D-Day? The weather was critical at D-Day, and the United States, the Allies, had an advantage that the weather, of course, comes from the west and moves to the east. So we knew better than the Germans what the weather was going to be. Initially, D-Day was planned for June 5th and was postponed a day because we knew that the weather was clearing. Rommel's weather predictors said it's not going to clear, and Rommel actually went to Paris for the day for his wife's birthday, and so was absent on June 6th. Why are they called mulberries? Well, I think that's just a matter of code names. Exactly how they ended up with those is sort of like, why is it gold, sword, and Juno? The components in a mulberry harbor were composed of mulberries, phoenixes, gooseberries, all manner of code names. And in fact, there's an interesting coincidence that some days before June 6th, a crossword puzzle appeared in the New York Times that used almost every code word involved in the Normandy invasion. It turned out to be a complete coincidence, but scared everyone to death. Let's see, a local guide at Normandy said one was used to deliver supplies. So actually both mulberries were used. The United States put theirs together very quickly in kind of haphazard manner and started getting supplies off within 2 weeks. The British used theirs and spent more time putting in all the anchors and connections they were supposed to. A strong storm came into the channel several weeks after June 6th, destroyed the American mulberry, and all its pieces were given to the British so they could repair theirs, where it continued to be used until we had taken Cherbourg and rehabilitated the port. Culin, I believe, did survive the war. What happened to Culin, who invented the hedgehog, I believe he did survive the war. Would I comment on the effectiveness of naval bombardment to provide cover for troops coming ashore? Unfortunately, our heavy naval bombardment missed the target. We also had air bombing. Most people were very concerned that they were going to hit the troops who were coming in close by their bombardment and waited just a little too long and missed dropping bombs on the beach, dropping them further inland. One of the things that was very effective, though, several destroyers, which of course have a smaller draft than the big battleships, saw that troops on the beach needed assistance and brought their vessels, the captains brought their vessels in very close and were able to provide direct fire to take out pillboxes on many of the beaches. Well, thank you all very much for joining me here today, and I hope you'll continue to stay tuned for our future broadcasts. Stay home, stay well, stay safe.